Today we will be talking about one of the greatest cultural phenomena in Kazakh literature, Herold Belger. Biknur Kisikov, writer, author of numerous novels, stories, and poems, member of jury of literature contest, inspirer and organizer of Kityap Fest festival. For many, Herold Belger was some kind of a mythical character, the epitome of everything holy and decent in Kazakh culture. He was an intellectual man, polyglot, professional translator, and writer who had mastered his knowledge of languages to an unprecedented level. Descendant of deported Germans, Belger lived in a distant village on the bank of the Yesil River, where from the very childhood he was exposed to the Kazakh language, which he was absorbing avidly. Over time, he was so very much immersed into it that he became the most eager protector and guardian of the Kazakh language. Ger Aga, as he was called by many people, knew every single aspect of Kazakh language, as well its literature and linguistics. He used to lament that not all Kazakhs fully realize the wealth and beauty of their mother tongue, and Belger would always speak the truth straightforwardly, regardless of what others might think. And we all need the truth to be spoken this way, but there are not enough Belgers for this. Unfortunately, Ger Aga was one of the kind. According to one of the largest retail networks in the country, Kara Shan Yerak, a controversial book penned by Yermek Tursunov, is on the top of Kazakhstani bestsellers list in both Russian and English. Kara Shan Yerak is followed by Kanat Tasibekov's Situational Kazakh, a socio-cultural guide into Kazakh language. In the middle of the list is Abai's Words of Edification, a book which seems to be as relevant as it has always been. The fourth place belongs to Zira Naurzabayeva's historical and mythological writing, The Eternal Sky of the Kazakhs. And the fifth place was taken by Dana Ormanbayeva's book, We Do Not Scold Children, which introduces the brand new examples of educational approaches. We have already talked about Belger in one of our previous episodes of the book club. As far as I remember, we discussed him in the episode dedicated to the classic of Kazakh literature, Abdi Jamil Nurpisov, as the two of them were not only close friends, but also colleagues and like-minded people. And it was because of their long-term cooperation that people got acquainted with the Russian translations of Master's writings. Let me remind you that it was Ger Aga who was in charge of translating the famous Blood and Sweat saga. And the novel dazzled more than ever because of his thorough work. Belger's translations list was not limited just by Nurpisov's works. He also translated Mylin's and Musrepov's writings, as well as books of many other classics of Kazakh literature. He was especially revered among professional translators. Belger was a person who combined the best of both worlds, Kazakh and German. He used to say that he was the most loved German among the Kazakhs. Sometimes he would mercilessly laugh at so-called Kazakh pies phenomenon, but then he would admit that he himself has a lot of traits of Kazakh pie too, a fact he was immensely proud of. From an unspoken speech by Herold Belger at a meeting with the first secretary of the CPSU Central Committee, Gennady Kolbin, December 31st, 1986. I want to say a few words about internationalism, and therefore I have to briefly tell you about my background. From the age of 6, I grew up and was brought up in a Kazakh village. I graduated from a Kazakh school. For quite some time, Kazakh was my primary language. Then I became an advocate for Kazakh literature and language. With great enthusiasm, I started translating Kazakh prose, and I translated a lot of it, more than 500 pages, 200 works altogether. I write research articles on Kazakh literature and language. I write about Kazakhs in my stories and novels. In general, I consider myself strongly Kazakhicized, and I think I have every right to speak about everything Kazakh, as well as about German, and about Russian too, for I am the product of these three cultures. There is no merit in that. It just happened. This was predestined by the will of the all-powerful time and circumstances, but I'm proud of it. I am, so to speak, an internationalist in education, in my beliefs, in linguistic environment, and even in family ties and relationships. Despite his straightforward and feisty personality, Belger knew how to be a good friend. He always admired his colleagues and friends, among whom were such famous writers as Kabdolov, Kikilbaev and Aitmatov. At times he would criticize the government, and at the same time, he would speak highly of certain statesmen, whom he treated with respect. For example, he spoke warmly of Tokayev, Tazmagambetov, and Kul Muhammad, emphasizing their spiritual and intellectual qualities. By the way, Belger once was involved in politics too. He was a member of the country's Supreme Council. As I mentioned it previously, Belger grew up in a family of Volga Germans who were deported to a distant village in Kazakhstan. There he graduated from the Kazakh school and later entered the Kazakh Department of Philological Faculty of the Kazakh Pedagogical Institute. He started his career as a teacher and then continued it in the literary magazine Juldiz. It must be said that back then, Juldiz, which was published by the Union of Writers, was a forge of literary talents. Over the years, the editors-in-chief of the magazine were such grandees as Maulenov, Musarepov, Khabdolov, Nurpisov, and others. Later, he tried himself as a writer, translator, and literary critic. In 1971, he became a member of the Writers' Union. As a writer, he was quite fruitful. He would publish 7 to 8 books in a year. Just recently, numerous volumes of Belger's writings were published, including 40 books and his 1,600 publications in periodicals. We won't be talking about every single Belger's book, although I have read a considerable amount of his writings. Today, we'll be talking about one of them, namely the House of the Wanderer novel. The House of the Wanderer novel was written by Herold Belger in 2003 and was later reprinted several times. It tells the story of the dramatic fate of Soviet Germans who underwent a massive forced resettlement in 1941. The novel consists of 3 parts. Each of them is named after the main characters: David, Christian, and Harry. Following their destinies, the author examines the fate of 3 generations of Russian Germans. An audio version of the novel with Zura Jumagulova's voiceover was released in 2017. Chapter 1. David. But where my house is, and where is my sanity? Anna Akhmatova. According to the decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, dated August 28, 1941, the State Defense Committee presented the following plan for the resettlement of Germans into the Kazakh SSR.
По мне, этот роман стоит особняком в творчестве Бельгера, ведь именно в нем он рассказывает о скитаниях и лишениях пережитых.
For me, this novel is a unique piece of writing, as it is the reflection of the wanderings and hardships experienced by the writer in his childhood. In the center of the plot, deported German paramedic David Ehrlich, despite the fact that the authorities treated him unfairly, does not give up. And one day in the distant, abandoned Kazakh aul, he finds new friends. And not just friends, but also a boy he later adopts, an orphaned local shepherd, Jaras. It is noteworthy that the gallery of characters in the novel is very diverse and contrasting. And in his work, the writer managed to masterfully combine Kazakh breadth of soul and German meticulousness. So despite all the hardships, David manages to preserve his best human qualities. He remains the same kind and naive person as he was before the deportation. He did not become bitter or indifferent, but on the contrary, he found his new vocation in this step. Being a paramedic, he started treating his new neighbors. And his neighbors in their turn completely dismiss the shameful fascist stigma, thinking of David as of a caring and responsive paramedic. For them, it doesn't matter anymore whether he's German or not, as David becomes a part of the village community, well respected for his eagerness to help. The novel describes the life of a village in which many Germans have recently settled. Not all of them are like David, and not all manage to pass these tests. Like the young teacher Christian, for instance, brother of David's wife. As it appears, Christian seems to be somewhat of the opposite of David. David tries to cultivate everything Russian in himself, whereas Christian, on the contrary, emphasizes his Germanness. The young man has an excellent knowledge of the literary German language. He reads German authors and collects folklore. Christian is appalled by the fact that the Germans, trying to protect themselves from offensive nicknames, changed their names to Russian names. In German songs and proverbs, Christian senses a familiar spirit of the lost homeland, never-ending wandering. Yes, homesickness, the inability to claim your motherland, forced wandering around the world, restlessness, an inescapable yearning for the home, the lonely fate of an internal wanderer, tragedy of homelessness. These are the most common and heartbreaking themes of German songs. Christian misses the German Volga region wiped off the face of the earth, and having found a photocopy of his lost homeland, he diligently reproduces his father's house on the drawing, unable to say farewell. Christian cannot subdue his yearning, he cannot adapt to a new life, and the labor army, which some of the inhabitants of the country were called up, finally breaks him. The strong, young man turns into a skinny, shattered, old man. Labor army broke many people before and after Christian. It was a machine for suppressing personalities, both on a physical and moral level. And even Oscar, Christian's friend, who was much stronger than Christian, cannot cope with the workload of the army. They both die, unable to endure this ordeal. The poem read by the head of culture in front of the labor army men turns out to be prophetic. If you did not kill a German, speak nothing of your love, place where you grew up, house where you lived. Don't you dare to call your home. Kill at least one. Kill with no second thoughts. As many times you shall see him, as many times you shall kill. In his novel, Belger was honest and straightforward, and when describing his protagonist, he was honest in displaying merits and demerits of the Germans, Kazakhs, and Russians. He would say, a typical Kazakh, it is astonishing. He can be poor, naked, and still would give up anything for the joy of another human being. The author described the house of David's friend, the postman, Nurkan, whose house was nothing compared to the house of the German. The novel is a great showcase of Belger's literary talent, and it is especially interesting how careful and attentive the author was in his narration of the life and customs of the Kazakhs. This is nothing but a genuine manifestation of Belger's sincere love for the culture and way of life of the people who have become dear to him. The author often used Kazakh words and expressions in his novel, which look very prominent, considering that the whole writing was penned in Russian. The novel is autobiographical. In David's character, Belger described his father, and in little Harry Walter, who loved literature from the very childhood, he was seeing himself. Harry finishes school brilliantly, but does not receive his graduation medal, and he does not have the opportunity to enter a university. All his misfortunes happen because he is German. But against all odds, Harry perseveres, he overcomes many obstacles, and eventually becomes a student. Now he is a student who, like anyone else around him, is entitled to study, and once he gets his passport, his happiness knows no limits. He's not a fascist anymore, but a full-fledged, law-obedient citizen of his new motherland. And on this positive note, Belger finished his novel. Belger's novel is difficult to read. It's difficult because all of this has happened at some point in history. The history which tore lives apart, lives of Germans and other people too. And it hurts to read about people who were destroyed only because they were born in the wrong place and in the wrong family. And still, there is this bittersweet and gentle aftertaste one can sense after finishing the novel. The spirit of a kind wisdom that saturates the entire book, as well as Gir Aga's words, the words of a Kazakh German who lived a bright and fascinating life.
Великого казахского немца, прожившего яркую и удивительную жизнь.